Welcome to the Stay on Course podcast. So excited for my next guest. I have Michele Bonds, and she is a fine artist based in New York City. Recently, she transitioned from the corporate life to a creative life. And now she's going to share her journey and the lessons she's learned along the way and what she's most excited about for the future. Today, we're going to talk about ingredients for success for a fully integrated life. Michele, welcome to the Stay on Course podcast.
Hi, Julie. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
I am super excited, and this topic is just it's next level. So I'm excited to get into it. But before I get started, Michele, I ask all of my guests, what is your favorite food?
So, this is a very tricky question for me, Julie. I've got to be honest, because food was my creative outlet for decades, and picking one is too much of a challenge. So, I would have to say that my favorite food is the dish that is created and served with consciousness and heart.
Oh gosh, Michele, we're going there. You know what? That's hysterical because my daughter, every time I cook, she's like, Mom, you didn't put the love in this.
Aw.
And I'm like, are you kidding me? You're gonna get me for like, did I not cut something exactly the way she wanted to? So that is speaking to my heart right now. And, sometimes you cook just to cook, and then other times you take your time and you put the love into it.
Yes, and I really learned this lesson this past Christmas when I was making dinner for myself and a few friends who were getting together. And I realized I was rushing through all of the cooking, and I thought, why am I doing this? I'm making all of this wonderful food, and I'm not even paying attention. So I stopped, and I would take a moment just to smell the thyme leaves between my fingers or feel the texture and the crispness of the carrot as I was chopping it, or just sort of hold the sugar up and trickle the sugar down as I was pouring it in the bowl. And I realized that it really is one of those metaphors for slowing down, right?
Yeah.
And paying attention and being mindful.
Oh my God. Michele, you are literally the first guest that has ever said that ever. So thank you for that very creative answer. All right, let's get right into these ingredients for success. Living a fully integrated life. I think this kind of I'm thinking that the way you talked about the food might be a little bit what we might talk about today and slowing down. Where do you want to start this conversation?
Well, if I had to pick three things, and it was very difficult to pick three things to really focus on in terms of, my greatest hits, what I really used to live by. But the first thing that I learned in the last few years is fill up your cup first. You cannot give to anyone or be of service to anyone if your own cup is empty, if your health isn't solid, if you haven't slept, if you haven't given yourself an opportunity to experience joy in your life, in your relationships. I had a very intense corporate career for many decades, and I worked on Wall Street, and I was, in service in those careers to some of the most brilliant people that I've ever had the honor of meeting and interacting with. And I gave it my all to the point that I was overgiving and not giving back to myself.
Hmm.
And I paid the price for that. And so the last few years, I have been adjusting and trying to figure out how to create a better quality of life while still being of service to others. And so my very first principle goes back to these words: fill up your cup first and give from the extra.
Now, okay, so we'll break it down. Each one of these we'll kind of dig into just a little bit. So filling up your cup, when you were in your corporate job, give me like the difference between how you're able to fill up your cup now than you were when you were doing your corporate job.
Well, it's like less of a what and more of a how, I would say. back then I was, very focused on getting to the office on time and making sure everything was taken care of for everyone else. And I never really stopped to think about what I needed to feel good and satisfied and whole. And so for example, when I wasn't feeling well, I would often go to work and push through
Mm,
anyway. And I was like not listening to myself. I wasn't listening to the voices inside of me. And so what I've changed is that I now check in with me every morning and I say, okay, how am I feeling? What do I need today? How do I feel energized if I'm not feeling energized? If I didn't get enough sleep, how do I make an adjustment in my day in order to make sure maybe I need a nap later in the day for 20 minutes? Maybe I need to go to bed a little bit earlier. Just being a lot more conscious about that. And, back when I was in my corporate life, my schedule and my calendar was really run more by the demands of my bosses or my calendar, expectations of others that I was not great at saying no to anything. So, learning how to hold my own boundaries and make sure that I had something to contribute, you know, I had extra to give. And, that I'm not saying that corporate is necessarily to blame for my choices. I made those choices.
sure.
I'm just saying that now that I've had time to stop and reset and realize that the choices that I was making weren't serving me, I've now moved towards a model where I can serve myself and others simultaneously.
Mm, yeah. And I'm just thinking about filling up your cup. Part of it is for me, okay, when I think of this filling up your cup thing, I feel like, gosh, when I was working in my corporate job, I was a bit of an imposter. They talk about imposter syndrome, but like, talk about an imposter. That was the version of me that I was when I was there because I really never fit in. So I think of that word imposter. I know imposter syndrome is like all these different things, but if you think about that word, I was thinking about how I am. But now, like filling up my cup is like for me, living a more authentic life. It's so weird because when you live a more authentic life, then work doesn't feel like work anymore. It's just a very weird place to be, right? When people are like, why do you work so much? I'm like, it's just not work. It's like I can't explain it. It's not really work when I'm doing it. So it's very hard. You need to take care of yourself, right? But I think that people what they don't understand is that it's a different kind of work.
I think that that's very fair, Julie. I have to say that,
Mm.
I can see is evidenced by the fact that you've got over 80 podcasts that you've done since I think 2022, that you really have found your stride and are doing something that you're genuinely passionate about. It does make a difference when you feel ownership over your time, how you spend it. And that for many people is cultural and finding the right culture for them. So some people do really well in that very intense, Wall Street culture. And I've seen and known many, many people that absolutely thrive in that. And I was one of those people. That was just my sweet spot for a very, very long time. And sometimes we just do really well in certain spaces for a while, and then our needs change. And then, we need to do something else. I was always extremely entrepreneurial in spirit. And I kept trying to fit into a corporate mold over and over again. I even went to a business school that specializes in entrepreneurship and then went back to a corporate life.
Yeah.
And I managed to carve, and I'm sure you did something to this effect too, Julie. Like you managed to carve a space out for yourself
Yeah.
in cultures, but having the ability to build your own is just a real gift.
Yeah, but again, you managed to create your own way within the corporate setting, but Not everybody appreciates that. They really just want you to like put your head down and work, and I get that. Some people say they want innovation, but then there's a price that you have to pay for that. So this is a whole other conversation. Um, but let's talk about receiving graciously. Let's talk about that one.
Okay, yeah. So the second principle is receiving graciously. I have always been a person that wants to be very helpful and wants to give and wants to help and wants to give. And, um, this kind of goes back to the first one of, you can empty your cup out doing that. And, one of the ways that you can fill back up is to receive graciously from others. And I've found for myself and many other people that I've spoken to that they're very, very good at giving and not so great at receiving help. And even when they receive help, sometimes they forget to say thank you. I mean, a good example is, there's always these exchanges that we engage in. And often the exchange we engage in with an employer is, they're paying you to do a thing and the money is the energy that's coming at you, and then you're giving your service to them, and that's the exchange. And this kind of goes back to the food thing as well. You can just be on autopilot doing things, but it feels very different when that exchange also comes with a, thank you, I appreciate what you did and how you did it.
Hmm.
Even just the simple words, thank you, as long as they're coming from an authentic place, can really fill a person back up. And now that I've been learning how to receive from people, I've been getting better at asking for help, and asking for support and asking for the things that I need. But I've learned that I don't always have to barter for it. That was one of the things I would do. It's like someone would do something for me and I immediately feel like I needed to do something for them, in order to like pay them back.
Yeah.
But I've had to learn that there's a lot of joy. Like I'm depriving someone else of the joy of giving when I start to dictate the currency that we're exchanging
Ah, it's interesting.
and grabbing control of that. Yeah, and you're taking yourself out of the flow
Yeah.
of giving and receiving when you start to, because what you're bringing to the table when you start to put a price on certain things, or start to say no, is you're taking yourself out of flow, you're depriving this person of joy, you're depriving yourself of joy, and you're saying I'm not deserving, I'm not worth it, and you're bringing that into the conversation. Why aren't you worth it?
Yeah. That's so interesting. And it's interesting, especially when you become an entrepreneur, it's this like exchange of energy. It's an exchange of giving and receiving. Whereas when I worked in my corporate job, I didn't really need to understand all of that as much. If that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. It
It's
makes a lot of sense. Well, because in the corporate structure, there's a lot of effort put into being clear about what the measurements of things are and what the expectations in terms of meeting these measurements are. And so there's like been a lot of structure put around things like that. And there's good things about that, which means things are measurable and expectations can feel clearer, I guess you could say. It depends on the situation. But, back to your point about, feeling like you fit in, etc. Some people don't work well with that much structure. Some people need a little more free flow. And, as a creative professional, I am finding even on the business side of my creative business that being in flow and being open to what is coming, to me and what is opening up in front of me is much more my natural state and much more comfortable for me. And it sounds like, Julie, you've found the same in your
you know,
business.
it's so funny as you're talking. Michelle, I know you didn't mean to do this, but I had an aha moment.
Uh, I'm thrilled that you had inspiration. Share it with me.
All right. So entrepreneurs are my people. Like I am serving my people now. This I never even like really got it until just now. Like the reason why this feels so good and what I'm doing is because the creatives are my people. And a lot of the people that worked in corporate don't necessarily understand what creative entrepreneurs are doing, you know? And a lot of those people are coming to me and I'm working with them and they get it. But when I go back and I talk to my corporate friends, like they don't get it. Like they're not, we're literally playing a different game. And it's like, it's so different than what we're used to and what we've been conditioned to that it takes like so long to break out of the old to the new. If that,
Yes, it takes a lot of consciousness and, willingness to change in
yeah,
order to do that. But it also can feel it feels very natural to you. It feels very natural to me. There's an influencer on Instagram that had posted something about the difference between, being like a corporation or a corporate professional versus being a creative professional. And they said, in a corporate setting, being vulnerable is bad because you're, in this volume game. And so avoiding vulnerability is the name of the game. But as a creative professional, being vulnerable is good because, you're a lot more one-on-one with people. Your business is a lot more about that connection with others and being distinct and different and not being like an every person solution necessarily.
yeah,
So, that really sort of speaks to, I think, what you're saying here is that shift of mindset. It really is almost like you kind of go to almost the opposite of
yeah, it is.
what this other system is, but there are reasons for that those mindsets are successful in those different spaces.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yes. And like I keep thinking about this, and this might take us a little off topic here, but it like when you leave corporate and we're talking about the fully integrated life. And I think that as a creative entrepreneur, that's what you've done. You've created a more fully integrated life. So I think that this makes sense to kind of bring up this point is that have you heard of Bob Proctor?
I've heard the name, yes.
Yeah. So he's got this thing that he talks about. He calls it the line of terror. And when I think about the line of terror, and he says everything good is on the opposite side of the line of terror. You just have to break it down and get to that
Mm.
opposite time. But I can tell you that like leaving my corporate job and coming up against this line of terror, it still happens to me. I still feel like I butt up against this line of terror on a regular basis, but I keep having to have to break it down because for so many years we've been conditioned to getting a regular paycheck, you know, and that is the way of the world of corporate life. You get this regular paycheck, you get your health benefits, you keep looking at your total compensation package. Like it's a very easy and hard existence, but easy in the sense that I never have to worry. As long as I show up for work and do my job, I'm going to get a paycheck. On the opposite side of that, you know, there's a lot more freedom and creativity, but the fear part comes in the form of like, oh my God, can I make my bills this month? Am I going to be able to go to Walmart? I was just doing this the other day. I was just like at Walmart and I'm like, can I buy my Zyrtec? Can I afford this? You know, like I was actually thinking that in my head, like, do I really need that? And before, when I was in my corporate job, I would just waste money. Like I was a money waster. I would go buy things I didn't need. I didn't care. It just was like, because the money just kept flowing in and I wasn't very responsible because it was almost like me getting back at whoever. Oh, if I spend my money, I'm going to make it anyway. Like that's the whole reason I'm doing this horrible thing is because I can at least spend money, you know? So it's one of those things.
Well, I think a lot of people engage in comforting behaviors, and spending, gives you the feeling of, comfort. It like the thing that you're buying or the fact that you can have it, or, it's a soothing mechanism to some extent. And you're right, especially in early stage entrepreneurship, and if you're bootstrapping, there's certainly an adjustment around your relationship to money and how, you're going to interact with that energetic. And, you get a much more immediate sense of, am I creating value for others or not? I mean, that's a very real thing. But it's such an interesting such an interesting shift, because that the line of terror, the way that I think about the line of terror is the dragon under the bed, you know. It's an amazing thing to have the opportunity to look under your bed and pull that dragon out, and or shine a light on it and go, "Oh, it's just a little lizard.
Yeah.
I can do this. I can do this." I mean, like if you look back in time, there were so many people for so long that were tradespeople. There's been times in history where people didn't work for these giant organizations. You kind of were, an individual small business owner, and lots of them. And so people have kind of always in those times needed to be on their hustle.
Yeah.
And now in corporate, there's like a very specifically defined hustle that you need to be on in order to, be successful in that environment. And, some people really love it. I mean, like I have friends and family members that just enjoy being in these structures so much and do really well, and they thrive. But if you're not somebody that is wired for that, you're always going to feel a little awkward, because you're sort of like, an apple amongst oranges, right?
Imposter.
And now you can go and find, other oranges or other apples and go hang out. And yeah, it takes a little while to build that structure if you haven't been in it. But there's a tremendous amount of joy in finding your people.
Yeah, that is. It's totally true. Yeah, it's just so interesting. So, what would be the next ingredient you want to delve into?
So my third ingredient is listen. And this requires a little explanation, because it's not just about listening to what others are saying or listening to what they're actually saying by observing body language. It's really about listening to yourself.
Hmm.
I've heard a lot of quotes recently from people who are later in their careers and have a lot of success, and, have been asked if you could give yourself advice, your younger self advice, what would it be? It's always trust your instincts. Trust your instincts. And in order for me to be successful in the corporate environment, and again, I'm talking about me, not other people, but for me to be successful in there, I had to block my instinctual voice. And I had to push that into a little box and not listen to it, because something in me kept saying, this isn't the right place for you. You need more of a canvas. You need a broader space to create. And, even though I'm a fine art artist and now that's what I do, I really actually consider myself a creative entrepreneur, because I don't just, right, I'm focused on art, but I'm always looking for other ways that I can be creating value for others and looking for other opportunities as an expansion from where I am. And, that expansiveness is, it's kind of a bit more like in the flow of the universe, or the mindset of the universe is abundant and strangely accommodating. Like it's all right there, and you can just go, oh, here it is. Something came to me, and maybe I should create this business, and maybe I should create that business. I have friends that are serial entrepreneurs, and they just look at the world a certain way. And as soon as they have another idea, they go, that's another great place where there's a market not being met, and I could add something. And, so it's, now I'm living in this more additive way, but that comes from listening to my gut instinct, not my intuition. My intuition, to me, intuition is your ability to see, the future and what's possible in the future. Like gut instinct is much more like a very much more now kind of feeling. And, looking around and saying what's possible. When I was in corporate, particularly back in my law firm days, my expertise was crisis management. I was very involved in the 2008 financial crisis and the events, the historical events that occurred during that time. And I really developed an expertise of being very calm in these very intense situations. And so when things have been, pretty active the last couple of months, that part of me kind of clicked in. And I was reminded too that nothing is ever wasted. And so listening isn't also just listening inside, it's listening outside, but also saying, oh, I've heard this song before. All right, how do I take this further now? So I think that would be my thoughts on that. How about you, Julie? What's your relationship to listening?
I mean, if I'm thinking about listening to myself, um, I have a very interesting intuition that happens. Like usually I know stuff. I know stuff that I shouldn't know. So, like, I guess there is like the two listenings, like knowing in the moment or like knowing information from other people. But then is this listening, you're more focused on listening to yourself. Yeah, I try to listen to myself as much as possible, and the way that kind of shows up is like when I want to say yes or no to something. Like I know
Mm.
if I should say yes or no to something. And if I do say yes to something I really should say no to, I know that. And I know that I'm making a mistake. But so I've been really trying to work that out and try to be true to it. Like, because what ends up happening is like, so there's multiple layers to this, very complicated. Because there's this intuition that comes up that says, hey, you should say no to this, right? But there's a part of you that wants to say yes to it. A little bit of a battle between the yes and the no. But I think if you lean into that intuition and you honor the intuition, it's just like your life goes better.
I've found that usually when I listen to that, things go pretty well. And it can be really challenging because sometimes something will come up and it looks really great. And you're like, oh, maybe for you, for example, this would be a great new client, like, and maybe you could use the cash or whatever the reason is with something in you. It's like,
Yeah.
mm.
I had an opportunity come up where I was going to work on something. I'm not going to go into the details, but like my intuition told me no. My mind was telling me yes. And so for a while I said yes until I'm like, you know what? I got to honor this thing. I got to say no. And that kind of sucks when you have to do that, but you got to honor the intuition. Eh,
Well, yeah, and you also have to create space for the yeses. If you've got a whole bunch of no's that you're in chaos dealing with, no yeses, no new yeses can come in. You know,
Yes, that's true. That's true. And I think like as a coach, once you've made a couple mistakes about working with the wrong people, you sort of get it. I think you need to make that mistake. I made the mistake, and it was a really it was a bad mistake. It was actually like a kind of a painful mistake. And then I realized like, there's certain people that I should be working with and certain people that I shouldn't be working with. And so when I usually make that distinction, it usually goes well. But you kind of have to learn through that.
yeah, and I mean that's the journey of being an entrepreneur. You're constantly learning. I mean, if
Yeah.
you prefer something with the illusion of stability, which is one of the things that corporate provides, kind of going back to your comment about, that regular paycheck and, health insurance. And, it gives you this illusion that like, all these things are taken care of and you don't have to worry about them. And then if you end up unemployed for a while, or, you decide to start your new job, or you get ill, you become ill, or whatever it is, all of a sudden, if that thing is gone, that structure is gone. It's not
Yeah.
just that you've lost your job, it's that you've lost this feeling, this illusion of safety.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and that's why I can't when I meet people that lose their job and they're like, oh, I lost my job. Like it's the worst thing that ever happened to them. And I'm like, I've lost my job like 8 times in my career for different reasons. Like I'm not sure how we haven't normalized this yet, that like, this is what happens to people. You're not going to stay in a job your whole entire life. And in many instances, if you're doing your job right, you're kind of working yourself out of a job. So that's a lot of the other thing that I was doing. I was like, literally creating these things that I would then work myself out of a job, because once I created the thing, they needed me for the creation because I was always in the creative space, even in the corporate world. And so what happened is they knew they would need me for stuff. They would bring me onto the project. I would begin the project, create the project, deliver it. And then once it's delivered, like they don't need me anymore. They really need me to go on to the next thing. But the next thing wasn't always available. So I kept finding myself in these positions. And I recognized that I was like I was an entrepreneur.
Hmm.
And so I don't know.
Yeah.
It's this whole, okay, so back to the listening. I went on a tangent and I know we got to go back to the listening thing. But I think that this is a complex thing when you talk about listening intentionally. Because I teach a listening class about the 4 levels of listening and the 12 roadblocks of listening. I have a class for that. It was actually ICF, so you can get credits for it. I did it a few times. But the point is you're talking about a totally different listening. Maybe we need to create a model for that. The 4 levels of listening to yourself.
Yes. I mean, there's a lot of talk about mindfulness. And, I know we started this conversation with a comment about mindfulness with regard to the food. But, it's easy to get, very busy and very overstimulated in the world that we live in right now. There's a lot of things coming at us. There's a lot of like, especially if I live in New York City, so there's like a lot of noise. Just go out the front door and there's just a ton of noise,
Hmm.
and there's a lot of people, and there's a lot of things moving, and there's a lot of things to take care of. And if you have a family and kids, there's, a lot of moving parts going on all the time. Um, and if you have a business, there's always a lot of stuff going on. But if you're very busy doing the busy work, you can't hear yourself finding the shortcuts.
Hmm.
So that is, what finally caught my attention enough for me to start to check in occasionally and say, okay, am I really paying attention, or am I just running?
Yeah. It's true. There's so much to do and so much to think about. There's 12 roadblocks to listening to other people, but I guess you can apply the same roadblocks to listening to yourself.
I don't know what the roadblocks are, but my intuition and my instinct say that you're probably right about that.
You're probably right. Yes. Yeah. That's so
Yeah,
interesting.
but listening to yourself is one of the ultimate acts of self-care and self-love.
Hmm. I love that. So let's get back to the title and bring this all together. The recipe for a fully integrated life, filling up your cup, receiving graciously, and listening intentionally. What do you want to kind of say to wrap this all up in a big box to give people as a gift today?
That's a really good question. Love yourself. Actually practice loving yourself.
Hmm.
A lot of people have told me throughout the years, look in the mirror in the morning and say, I love you.
Mm,
And I decided to spend a month-long meditation last year with the question, how do I love myself more? And I started to do this where I would look in the mirror and say, I love you. You're beautiful. I can do anything. And it took me about 6 months of doing it to get to the point where I believed it.
wow.
But loving yourself is one of the greatest acts of self-care, especially in a world that is set up and repeatedly gives you messages about how you're not enough and you don't have enough and you're not worth something unless you have these things or these accomplishments or this resume or this title or et cetera, et cetera. Like your inherent value is based on external things. One of the greatest acts of self-love and self-care, and a great act of, in some ways, rebellion, is to look in the mirror and say, I love you and mean it.
Loving that. Loving that. What are you excited about right now that you're working on?
So I'm working on some new artwork. My artwork is generally abstract and asymmetrical. So I'm now working on some new work that is abstract and symmetrical. And so I really love to play with the ideas of the tension between order and chaos. And so
Mm.
arguably the asymmetrical work, the more organic work would be leaning in more towards the chaos. And so now I'm working on some new work that's a little more speaking to the beauty of the order in the universe. And it's called In the Beginning because, in the Bible text, in the beginning, God created. The first act of spirit is to create. And I really wanted to honor that. So that's what I'm working through right now in the studio, and I'm really excited. I'm going to be taking that to the Superfine Art Fair this April, and I'm going to be debuting those pieces at the fair.
That's so amazing. And tell our audience where they can find out more about your business.
Great. Well, I on my website, it's www.michelebonds.com. It's Michelle with one L, and it's like James Bond with an S on the end. I'm also on Instagram at Michele Bonds Art, and I actually just launched my YouTube Shorts, which is also at Michele Bonds Art, and I'm on LinkedIn as well.
Amazing. Michelle, this has been a very, very interesting conversation, and I hope the audience has taken away something from this. And I believe that there were so many good nuggets of truth here. And I just want to thank you for being a guest on the Stay on Course podcast.
Julie, thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here.